Big government as an explicit political agenda went out of style a few decades back, helped off the stage in part by the right-leaning perspective known as neoliberalism. But as governments here and around the world roll out massive state aid in the wake of COVID-19, even neoliberal stalwarts now seem to be welcoming the state back with open arms. Has its time come again? Let's ask. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, Bhaskar Sunkara, founding editor of Jacobin magazine and author of The Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. And in Baynesville, Ontario, near Cornwall, on the banks of the St. Lawrence River, there's Sean Speer, assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and a fellow in residence at the Public Policy Forum. And gentlemen, it's good to have both of you back on TVO, two familiar faces for our viewers. I want to start by reading a couple of different quotes here, and then we'll start our discussion. This one is, Bhaskar, you'll be glad to know, from Jacobin magazine in late April. The pandemic hit after 4 decades of neoliberalism had depleted state capacities in the name of the superior efficiency of the market, fostered deindustrialization through the globalization of production, and built fragile financial structures secured only by the state, all in the name of short-term profitability. And then here's what the Financial Times editorial board wrote in early April in a piece called "Virus Lays Bare the Frailty of the Social Contract." Radical reforms reversing the prevailing policy direction of the last 4 decades will need to be put on the table. Governments will have to accept a more active role in the economy. They must see public services as investments rather than liabilities, and look for ways to make labor markets less insecure. Redistribution will again be on the agenda. The privileges of the elderly and wealthy in question. Policies until recently considered eccentric, such as basic income and wealth taxes, will have to be in the mix. Bhaskar, I'm not sure you ever thought you'd live long enough to see the Financial Times echoing something that you might read in Jacobin magazine, but what do you make of that quote?
Well, I think it's a return to the norm. Now, the Financial Times and venues like it haven't always been in favor of this unfettered free market. This was a brief period from the late 70s and through the 90s that there was this consensus, and it was broken in part by the effects of financial deregulation and the 2008 crash. So there's always been a role for the state to play. The private capital has always been willing to work with the state. The question is, will private capital be willing to take direction from the state? So in other words, you have carrots and sticks when it comes to the state playing a role, planning certain things, shaping certain outcomes. Capitalists are always willing to accept subsidies and support, but they're not always willing to have the state take the measures necessary to secure not just the short-term interests of profit, but the medium and long-term interests of development. And I think that's the difference. So when we talk about neoliberalism, neoliberalism isn't and wasn't the retreat of the state. It was the state doing other things, the state pushing an agenda of deregulation and deunionization. Now we're seeing that, in fact, a healthy, prosperous economy that works for the bottom 80% of the economy requires strong unions and requires some sort of role for the state.
Sean, what signal do you think that FT editorial sends?
Well, it's striking, as you say, Steve. The Financial Times, along with some other publications, have, for the past 25 or 30 years, been the chief proponents of a set of ideas and policies that have been described broadly as neoliberalism. That agenda came about in the 1970s, 80s, as Bhaskar says, in response to economic stagnation that was seen as being shaped by government overreach. That is, the economies of Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere were facing economic stagnation, stagflation as it was called at the time. And there was a view that government needed to be retrenched in order to catalyze innovation, entrepreneurship, wealth creation, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that experience has produced outcomes that are broadly positive. But it's so important to point out that response, that agenda reflected a particular set of circumstances in a particular moment in a particular place. And where I agree with Bhaskar is that those conditions have markedly changed, and it seems to me that that agenda needs to be adjusted, reshaped, and refined to reflect the new and emerging challenges of our particular era. And it seems to me that the COVID-19 crisis has only accelerated the need for us to have this debate about the role of markets, the role of government, and ultimately how to create the conditions for broad-based economic opportunity.
And Sean, just to make sure everybody's on the same page here, when we talk about neoliberalism, we're talking about an agenda that sort of believes very deeply in balanced budgets, in cutting taxes, in privatizing state enterprises, freeing the markets to do their thing, reducing the welfare state. Is that basically got it?
That's right. And what's interesting, Steve, for a Canadian audience is, in a way, Canada has been at the forefront of this agenda. In a way, the 1988 free trade deal with the United States, followed by the NAFTA that pulled Mexico into a continental free trade arrangement, was really at the beginning of this era. But as many people say, any good idea can become bad or false when it's deformed or exaggerated. And I think where you'll see agreement increasingly on the left and right is that a passivity about shaping market outcomes needs to be revisited. The best, most concrete example that we've observed in recent weeks is our inability to produce personal protective equipment within our own borders. The shifting of that productive capacity to countries like China was the result of deference to markets. This wasn't a case of markets malfunctioning. It was a case of markets doing precisely what they do, which is to allocate resources in the most efficient, cost-effective way. And I think what you're seeing from the left and the right is a recognition that there is a role for politics, there is a role for government to shape market outcomes in a way that emphasizes priorities beyond simple economic efficiency.
Bhaskar, let me give you the neoliberal argument, which is that the share of the world's population living in extreme poverty has fallen from 36% 30 years ago to 10% just a few years ago. They would say that's a win for our approach. Are they wrong?
Well, I think it has been a win for doses of liberalization, but if you actually look where poverty has been reduced, it's been the state-managed, authoritarian state-managed liberalization in China, the continued development of countries that had developmental states, like Taiwan, like in South Korea, and in particular, the massive decreases in poverty that occurred under the administration of the first two Lula terms. Lula, the representative of the Brazilian Workers' Party, who used his own variant of what you would call a global South version of almost third way social democracy in Brazil. So these weren't really classic and extreme examples of neoliberalism. Again, that's kind of a broad umbrella term that we probably shouldn't get into too many definitional arguments over. But I think in all these cases where you saw extreme decreases in poverty, you saw the state play a major role shaping outcomes. And again, throughout the history of the United States, throughout the history of Canada, capitalists have been willing to take the state support, but they've been less willing to have the state say, okay, you just took our money, you just took our subsidy, you just benefited from this price control. Now we have to tell you what to do in a way that might not always benefit your short-term profits, but will benefit the polity as a whole in the medium and long term. So again, something like NAFTA. Well, if you actually look at the stats on NAFTA, it might be that NAFTA was a net benefit for workers in Canada and the United States. But the benefits were spread so thinly in the prices for consumers going down in a few things, in employment spread very thinly, but it's also devastated certain communities so absolutely that that's created unintended social and political side effects, and side effects that were unintended but very predictable. If and only if we were thinking about medium and long-term consequences, and we were thinking beyond the economic realm into political and social effects of our policies.
You know, Sean, in some respects, we did see this movie a little bit during the Great Recession, where when Wall Street, among others, behaved extremely recklessly, it was the state that had to rush in and help protect people from the ravages of that. And now here is the state again riding into the rescue to protect people from the ravages of this pandemic. Does it suggest to you that we're about to usher in I mean, to the extent anything is permanent in this world, a permanent new era of bigger government?
I think that is likely, and I think it's arguably justified. But let me be clear about that. I think I said earlier, Steve, that the agenda of market reform reflected a certain set of circumstances in the 1970s and 80s, and I think those circumstances have changed. It's not that Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Milton Friedman, and others were wrong. It's simply that the conditions have changed, and we need to change our perspective, our agenda accordingly. And it seems to me the two twin forces that they could not have predicted is the rise of intangible capital. That is to say, an economy that's increasingly driven by intangible assets such as intellectual property, software, data, algorithms, and so on, which have unique features and characteristics relative to the traditional production economy, including a tendency towards a winner-take-all paradigm. The second, which is related, is the rise of China. When this neoliberal agenda began to take shape, one could envision a scenario of global cooperation along broadly smaller liberal lines. But the Chinese are advancing an agenda that looks quite different. That might be characterized as a technological mercantilism. And I think what you're seeing in the US and elsewhere is policymakers recognize that this amounts to a different economic context and one which will require a different economic policy.
Well, we've had too much screaming agreement between you two so far, but I think I finally found the spot where you two diverge. And that is, Bhaskar, I got a feeling you don't think Reagan and Thatcher were ever right for any era at any time. Have I got that right?
Well, I think one thing that we can, well, first of all, I should just not complicate questions. Yes, you have that right. I think in general,
Okay.
the policies of Reagan and Thatcher were destructive in the not just the United States, but its impact, in many other countries in the world. But I will admit that the crisis of the 70s was real. There was a real crisis of profitability. There was stagflation. There were other economic crises that were hurting workers. So I think there's a certain view on parts of the center left that would say, okay, well, nothing was really going on in the 70s. There was no need for any sort of adjustments. The question is, what kind of change do we need, and how much were the crises of the 70s temporary problems that could have been resolved either within the old framework or with tweaks that empowered labor instead of defagging labor? So, for example, how much of the crisis of the 70s was a result of contingent things like the OPEC shock? Were the result of increased international competition that domestic economies would have adjusted to over time? Were the result of other things in the power of trade unions? Because we've seen, I don't know the stats in Canada, and I imagine the parallels are pretty similar. We saw in the United States the absolute stagnation of real wages despite productivity increases. And this is a result of weakened unions. People are working harder and harder. They're working longer hours. They're more efficient when they're at work. And yet their wallets are stagnating. And that's one reason why they take out credit card debt, why they speculate in second homes that they're going to maybe try to flip to make some cash, because these are the accesses to credit that they have. This is the way that they can actually secure a middle class lifestyle. And I think that the system has been unable to speak to people's very noble aspirations to take care of themselves and their families. And this has led to things and exacerbated problems like the opioid crisis that's devastating huge swaths, and not just the United States, but Canada and elsewhere. And I think these are the things that neoliberals have not cared about, in part because they've just talked about increasing our aggregate productivity and efficiency, even though the spoils of this increase are going to a narrower and narrower band of people.
Sean, I guess we should remind people at this point that you were, I think, an economic advisor to former Prime Minister Stephen Harper during the Great Recession and saw that conservative government bring in spending plans and run a deficit that was at that time the biggest in Canadian history, dwarfed, of course, by what's been going on lately during this pandemic. And now that you see what the reaction is of this government of Canada, how should conservatives view the role of government nowadays and going forward?
It seems to me this is, for those on the right, the most fundamental question, Steve. And it's one I've been grappling with, not just in the context of the COVID-19 crisis, but really since the election of Donald Trump. As Bhaskar says, I think what the election of Donald Trump demonstrated is that the benefits of the economic consensus for the past quarter century or so had been broadly distributed, and we could debate about the extent to which they were worthwhile. But what it also showed is that there were a concentration or a clustering of those who were struggling in this new economic environment, those without post-secondary qualifications, those who work in sectors that were being reshaped by technology or globalization. And it seems to me there's an onus on conservatives who believe in the role of markets, who believe in the limits of government, to put forward a constructive agenda to respond to those legitimate concerns. More fundamentally, though, in recent work that I've done, Steve, with the Public Policy Forum and elsewhere, I think the confluence of the two forces I talked about earlier, the rise of intangible capital and the new geopolitical competition that has been hastened and accelerated by the COVID-19 crisis between the United States and China, will require Canada to adopt a new economic policy framework to navigate this new world. We're going to have to place a much greater focus on cultivating sectors and technologies here within our borders that can participate in global supply chains, that can compete for global market share, and that will necessarily involve a new industrial strategy, in my view. And that's different from big government. I mean, we can have a debate about going back to the Financial Times editorial about redistribution and the social safety net and so on. But it seems to me that the moment calls for a conservative realism that recognizes that conditions on the ground have changed and that it will require adjustments to our policy thinking accordingly.
I did read that paper you wrote on an industrial strategy, and those are two words I never thought I'd hear come out of a conservative's mouth, but there you go. You are morphing with the times. Now, having said that, I wonder whether we should look to Scandinavia as an example of what maybe North America ought to be doing next. And by that, I don't mean sort of Bernie Sanders's social democracies that he often points to, but if we look at Scandinavia, they have had, yes, a strong welfare state, but with some fairly robust capitalism featuring some conservative governments along the way. What do you think of that option, Bhaskar?
Well, I think the social democratic dream of Scandinavia is still alive and well in many cases. In a country like Sweden, it's still governed by the center left. In Denmark, governed by the center left with support, with confidence from the far left. In Finland, a Nordic country, it's governed in part with the Left Alliance, a far left party having ministers, the education minister Lee Anderson in that government. So I think that these governments are still oriented in such a way that they prioritize whatever mix of policies have at the end result the preservation of a welfare state and the well-being and advancement of their working classes. And that's what I want as a left-winger. I don't just have a knee-jerk support of every single tariff, every single heavy-handed state intervention in the economy. I only support those policies that will advance the interest of working-class people. And for example, in these Nordic countries, they've traditionally been very reliant on exports. They haven't been imposing a ton of tariffs. They've been willing to say, okay, sometimes you need to protect certain industries, and sometimes you have to just let them compete. And I'm fine with all of that. I'm fine with finding that policy mix as long as we think about our end result of our politics being the uplift of working class people and not just the pursuit of these abstract numbers of wealth and efficiency and whatnot, even if the gains of this efficiency are only going to a very, very small group of people at the top.
Sean, in which case, I really need to get a better understanding of where you think conservatism today diverges from what Bhaskar is talking about. Because as we've pointed out, we're hearing a lot of agreement between you two, which I didn't think we would. So where does conservatism diverge now?
Well, let me say two things, and I'll be as brief as I can. I think first of all, I think we are indeed going to have a more focused, more intentional industrial policy to cultivate industrial capacities here within our borders to be able to compete in the global economy, where the rewards to scale are stronger than they've ever been before because of some of the issues that I described earlier. Secondly, though, and this is, I think, an important distinction, it seems to me that the biggest obstacle to Bhaskar's vision for renewed commitments to socialism in Western countries is arithmetic. Here in Canada, the deficits that will be run by our federal government in the provinces this year are likely to exceed 20%. Our provinces are almost across the board are already unsustainable on terms of their fiscal capacity over the long term. And that's largely driven, Steve, as you know, by our aging demographics. As George Will likes to say, we've attached one of our most dynamic sectors, that is medicine, to our fastest growing population, that is seniors. And that combination, the confluence, is putting enormous pressure on government's fiscal capacity. And so it seems to me these conditions will preclude large-scale entitlement reforms to expand the role of government in our societies. If anything, the COVID-19 crisis will make it even more challenging to cover the costs of our previous commitments. And I think that's the biggest obstacle standing in the way of the expansion of government that Bhaskar and others would like to see come out of this crisis.
Well, Bhaskar, let me ask you to finish up on that. We've got about a minute left to I'll put it out this way. 90 years ago, we had the Great Depression, and what emerged from that was Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. What do you suspect will emerge from the current recession/depression we are in the midst of now?
So we have our immediate crisis that everyone can see, the coronavirus crisis, hospital capacity getting overrun in certain areas and whatnot. Everyone can see that. We also can see the economic fallout of the lockdown. Businesses shuttering, small businesses that have driven a lot of employment in both the US and Canada are teetering on the brink. Then, of course, the response is massive government stimulus, massive government bailouts, a new role for the state. I think people now are starting to see that when the state wants to act, the state can act. And it's very hard in countries where there's still persisting poverty, where there's still declining deindustrialization and all these other problems that people are feeling, to just go back to the world where the state just said, oh, these problems are too big, we can't handle it. Because in our lifetimes, we would have seen government writing people checks. We would have seen government propping up businesses. And I think, hopefully, people look at the slow-moving crises that they're dealing with, look at poverty and hunger, look at just general malaise and desperation and say, these are crises that we want our state managers and we want our domestic elites to feel too. And we want some sort of action. So I think the precedent of large-scale state intervention isn't going away. And if we do need the type of shared sacrifice that Sean was talking about, then we need to make sure that we're going to unions, we're going to working class people, and we're saying, okay, here's the bargain. You maybe diminish your wage demands here and here, but we're going to create the kind of system that will benefit you in the long run and will empower you in the long run. We won't pull this bait and switch that we played in the 1970s, and people should have no reason to trust the conservatives would be willing to make a fair and honest bargain with working class people along those lines.
Gentlemen, that's our time. I want to thank Bhaskar Sunkara and Sean Speer for joining us tonight on TVO for a really great conversation. Be safe, you two. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.